Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Anara Tabushalieva, along with co-host Dr. Victor Fett, Dr. Katerina Shrey, and our program producer, Professor Larry Shrey. We host a weekly discussion panel on Russia's war on Ukraine with guests from Ukraine, military experts, medical personnel, academics, artists, literary figures, and relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Special thanks to Marshall University Libraries and MUIT for making this weekly event possible. If you are joining us live on Teams, please feel free to post any questions for our guest. Today's guest will be introduced by Dr. Victor Fett.
Thank you, Anara. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce our today's guest, Dr. Alexander Motyl from New York, our constant contributor, professor of political science at Rutgers-Newark, a specialist on Ukraine, Russia, and the USSR, on nationalism, revolutions, empires, and theory, author of 10 books of nonfiction. Dr. Motyl is contributor of dozens of articles to academic and policy journals, op-ed pages, magazines, The Hill, and many other publications. We are honored to host him again on our 196th weekly meeting of MUkraine discussion group at Marshall University. Please, Dr. Motyl.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, everybody else, for coming in and listening. As you mentioned that this has been going on for 196 times, it occurred to me that it would be fitting if your 200th program were to be perhaps the last one, in the sense that there would be a final just peace. I'm not betting on that, but it's at least semi-conceivable, and certainly something to be hoped for. It's hard to be an expert in today's world, especially when it comes to Russia, Ukraine, and the war, since so much is being written and so much is being said in social media, on the mainstream media, on television, on the internet, on YouTube. And I mean, these aren't the times of the Soviet Union, of Sovietology, where Sovietologists were a kind of sect of learned men and women who knew things that no one else did. I say that as a preamble to my talk, since much of what I will discuss is certainly well known to you. Perhaps the analysis or the projections that I will try to draw might be somewhat different from those that you expect, although there too, I suspect, there's very little that hasn't been said that needs to be said. I'd like to talk about the war first, then about the situation domestically within Ukraine, and I'll keep these points short since there's been so much coverage in the media. I'd like then to shift to Russia, and finally to do a somewhat closer discussion of the proposed so-called peace plan that's been in the news. Let me start with that, because it's in the news and it's certainly on everybody's mind. As you know, the so-called peace plan was announced by the Americans about a week and a half ago. To everybody, much to everybody's surprise, I personally was somewhat shocked to learn that there were these discussions that were taking place in the background, and that not only were they taking place, but they seemed to have produced a concrete 28-point plan. That seemed to require a fair amount of negotiation, some degree of knowledge, and certainly a large degree of patience. As it then turned out in the course of the next few days, first of all, the plan was roundly condemned by just about everybody, certainly by just about everybody, by everybody that I read, whether again in the mainstream media or in other sources. Everybody from Newt Gingrich to Mark Rutte, to a variety of analysts, journalists, and others in the United States and abroad, reacted savagely to the so-called plan, criticizing it as essentially a step-by-step guide towards Ukrainian capitulation. And the question then emerged, I mean, good Lord, how could the Americans have produced a plan that reflected Vladimir Putin's vision of the world so closely? And then, if we're to believe the stories that we've encountered in the press, it looks like the plan might have been, or probably was indeed, hatched somewhere in the Kremlin, perhaps within the FSB. A number of analysts pointed out to discrepancies in the translation. They seemed wooden. If translated back into Russian, they made sense. But translated into English, they didn't quite make sense. And then Rubio said, contradicted himself, saying on the one hand, well, the plan isn't ready, and then a few hours later, or a few days later, saying something to the effect that the plan was actually somehow rather concocted with American participation. Anyway, a whole series of finger pointings, denials, emendations, and things like that occurred. And it seems to have become pretty clear that even if it wasn't the Russians who drafted the first draft, that it seems to be the case that they were doing this in conjunction with President Trump's special envoy to the world, I guess, Mr. Steve Witkoff, a man who's a modest billionaire and who made his money in New York State real estate, like Donald Trump, and unsurprisingly, an individual with no knowledge of Russia, of no knowledge of Ukraine, of no knowledge of the history of these two countries, and even less knowledge of the war. And then sort of to top things off, as you know, there appeared a transcript of his conversation with his interlocutor on the Russian side, Mr. Ushakov, in which he was providing Ushakov with tips on how to negotiate with Donald Trump. The response to that was also immediate and immediately negative. A group of Republicans and Democrats even suggested that Witkoff be fired because his activity was treasonous. That is to say that he was a traitor. Whether or not he is or not, well, I don't know. It's been speculated as to, the reasons for his love affair with Mr. Putin, and one could arguably say that his love affair with Putin is similar to or reflective of the love affair that Mr. Trump has with Mr. Putin. Some people suggest that the two of them, or certainly Witkoff, are on the Kremlin's payroll. Others simply say that they're impressed by his tough guy demeanor, that they're impressed by authoritarian leaders. There is, of course, the possibility that they truly believe what Putin says to them. That would imply an astounding degree of ignorance and naivete. And of course, it's quite possible that some combination of all three or four factors might be at work. In any case, the Americans then sat down with the Ukrainians. They produced their own peace plan. I haven't seen it. It apparently consists of 19 points. And apparently those points that are most contentious and most unacceptable for Ukraine have somehow been dealt with. And the three that come to mind, amongst the many that could come to mind, are a cap on the number of personnel in the Ukrainian armed forces. The original plan said 600,000 without saying anything at all about Russian armed forces. Ukraine was obligated to abandon the territories in the Donbass that it currently still holds. And last but not least, Russians, and of course, technically everybody else, would get a free out of jail card for whatever atrocities they might have committed. There are lots of other points that could easily be discussed and rejected. I actually went through this exercise with my students, my undergraduate students, and one of the students captured the quality of the text very nicely. saying that it's juvenile, it's incomplete, it makes all these assumptions and so on. Where did this thing come from? Again, it would be easiest to assume that the Russians somehow or other foisted this upon Witkoff and Trump, which is perfectly possible. It's easy to assume that somehow or other the Russians and the Americans worked together on this particular plan. And again, so we just don't know. I mean, the bottom line is we simply don't know. Whatever the case, it's disturbing. The bad news is that the Americans could have signed on to this kind of plan, even if only temporarily. The just as bad news would be that they were somehow complicit in drafting this plan. The only ray of light in this entire mess is the fact that very quickly the Trump administration backtracked. Representatives met with the Ukrainians in Geneva, and they appear to be now talking to the Europeans about some kind of counter plan. Putin, meanwhile, has made it absolutely clear that he's unwilling to compromise. He insists that Ukraine leave those two territories, Donetsk and Luhansk, those oblasts that it still currently controls. He insists that the referenda that took place in late 2022, during which ostensibly the entire populations of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson Oblast declared their fealty to Russia. He claims that they were legitimate. Everybody knows they're not, but what can you say? And then, of course, he still claims, as he's been claiming for over a year, that Mr. Zelensky is not legitimate. This coming from a fascist dictator who's manipulated the last 3 elections. It's decidedly rich, to put it mildly, but it is the position that Putin has adopted, and to some degree is the position with which Trump and certainly Witkoff seems to sympathize. What next in terms of the peace prospects? My own view is that peace is possible only under two sets of circumstances. One, and both of them concern Putin. To start with the more general proposition, as long as Putin remains in power, there will be no peace. That's my broad proposition to the group. There will be no peace as long as Putin is in power. And the reasons for that are several. One is he owns the war. After all, if you may recall, just in the days leading up to the outbreak of the invasion, it was very clear that he made this decision pretty much on his own. 2, the war has been a disaster. I need not repeat to this group that Russia has lost over 1 million soldiers, dead and wounded. Its economy is a mess, very much as a result of the war. NATO has expanded. Ukraine has turned against Russia. The only saving grace that Russia has is that it's now more firmly allied with that powerful, geopolitically powerful state, North Korea. I'm being facetious, of course, but in effect, Putin has managed to transform Russia from a regional great power to an appendage of North Korea and China. So for all sorts of reasons, the war has been a disaster, but it's his war, it's Putin's war, and it will remain his war as long as the war continues. For him to lead, and of course, since it's his war, his legitimacy and his authority are very much directly a function of the prospects of the war. For him to end the war today along the line of demarcation between the Ukrainian and Russian forces would effectively mean to accept defeat. Because after all, he has claimed the entirety of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Luhansk, and Donetsk as parts of the Russian Federation. For him to stop fighting today or tomorrow or very soon thereafter without having fully conquered these territories would effectively mean that the war had been senseless, was simply an elaborate exercise in the killing, in the suicidal killing of a vast number of Russians and an even larger number of wounded. So Putin's political career, and dare I say his physical survival, depend on his being able to complete the war in some manner that enables him to say that he won. At the very least, it would have to be a recapturing of all of the Donbass. It's been calculated by analysts that it would take him roughly 4 to 5 years for that to happen, given the pace at which Russia has been expanding and gaining Ukrainian territory. One military historian, Phillips O'Brien, calculated, he took seriously the metaphorical claim that Russia's advances have been snail-like, and he calculated based on the movement of a snail that in fact snails move more quickly than the Russians do in Ukraine. Which is simply to say that it will take at least 4 to 5 years of intensely bloody fighting, and with probably 2.5 million casualties at the rates things are going, for Putin to be able to conquer these territories. Ukrainian casualties, it's been surmised, are somewhere between 1 to 3 or 1 to 5 in those ratios. Let's assume for the sake of argument that is 1 to 4. That would mean that if the Russians have lost roughly 1 million men, the Ukrainians would have lost about 250,000. We don't know exactly, but that does not seem unreasonable, and it accords with the estimates provided by some independent analysts and institutions. So my argument is that Putin will not abandon the war until or unless he can claim some kind of victory. Inasmuch as his health seems to be holding up, that means that the only chances of the war ending in this scenario is for some kind of coup or putsch, some kind of diplomatic illness to take place that would deprive Putin of power and replace him with other individuals. Those other individuals need not be Democrats. They could be just as vile as Putin, but inasmuch as this wouldn't be their war, they might be more inclined to just get out and leave things alone. But of course, we don't know. The other scenario is for Putin to lose the war. At this point in time, Russia does not have the capacity to embark on some kind of breakthrough and to bring about a capitulation of the Ukrainian forces. This, again, is the conventional wisdom amongst military specialists, so I'm simply repeating what they're saying. But at the same time, Ukraine doesn't seem to have the capacity to drive the Russians out. So this kind of tit for tat where the Russians expand a bit, the Ukrainians get some territory back. Sometimes they get more, sometimes they get less. Sometimes the Russians advance a bit more quickly than the snails, sometimes they don't. This is likely to continue for the foreseeable future, barring some kind of major Wunderwaffe, miracle weapon that might be developed by one or both sides. So given that, the only way in which Ukraine could prevail and force Putin's hand would be for the West to intervene in a more enthusiastic manner than it's done so far. We don't know whether that'll happen. You may recall the Biden administration was always criticized for being insufficiently devoted to helping Ukraine and to being too little and too late. But in retrospect, what the Biden administration did, which was to offer a firm commitment to Ukraine, and it looks pretty good in contrast to the policies adopted by the Trump administration. On the other hand, the good news is that the Trump administration is selling weapons to Ukraine via the Europeans, which is a perfectly fine arrangement. Trump gets to claim that he hasn't committed boots on the ground to Ukraine. He's making money, which is very important. The Europeans have money. They don't have the weapons. They don't have the soldiers. And thereby, Ukraine gets what it needs. Trump is happy, and the Europeans are contributing to a Ukrainian victory. Will that happen? We don't know. That would probably necessitate a far greater commitment to providing Ukraine with a variety of weapons, especially missiles and things like that, that would enable it to strike more deeply into Russian territory. But again, unless some major rupture takes place, the war is likely to continue at its present pace for the foreseeable future. Can Russia sustain this? It's been argued and it's been asked, including by me, how long can any country sustain the kind of military losses that Russia has had? It's 1.195 million military losses and about 250 to 300,000 dead. So that provides a kind of 1-to-3 ratio, which is considered to be normal for death to wounded proportions. The economy is not doing well. The Russian central bank, has just forecast 2 upcoming years of negative growth. Interest rates are high, inflation is high. All of this bodes very, very poorly for Mr. Putin. And of course, he is highly reliant on the Chinese for dual-use technology and on the North Koreans for ammunition and soldiers. So none of this suggests that the regime is doing especially well when it comes to the war. So the question is, how long can this be sustained? My response is probably not long, but we just don't know. That's really the question, that we don't know. To flip the coin and look at the other side of the coin, how long can Ukraine sustain what it's been undergoing? And there too, we don't know. On the one hand, working in Ukraine's advantage is the fact that this is an existential war for Ukraine. It's an existential war for Putin, but this is an existential war for Ukrainians. They need to fight in order to exist. And there's no better reason for fighting, than the existential need to do so. And many of them, of course, are fighting at the same time. As you know, there is a manpower shortage. That's not necessarily as serious as it may seem, in as much as something like 90% of the deaths on both sides of the line of demarcation are due to drones. So in that sense, one could argue that Ukraine is conserving its manpower. But at the same time, the fact that so many young Ukrainian men have fled the country and or are interested or have deserted suggests that that kind of patriotism, that upswing in patriotism that occurred in February of 2022 is no longer quite as manifest as it was in the past. So how long can Ukraine sustain this? And of course, the economy, I mean, I need not go into the details. It's obviously experiencing very serious difficulties as well. The logical solution, and I think I'll end on that. Well, maybe I got a few more minutes. The logical solution to this conundrum, if one presupposes more or less rational leaders on both sides and all sides, within the United States, within Europe, within Moscow, and within Kyiv, would be something along the lines of declaring a ceasefire along the current line of demarcation, first for a week, then for a month, then for a few months, and then perhaps for permanently. That's generally the way these conflicts like this can be regulated, at least initially. And then to work on some kind of division. Which parts does Russia, which parts of Ukraine that it currently controls remain de facto under Russian control, which part remain in Ukraine's hands. These are issues that are to some degree negotiable. Mr. Zelensky has already said on a number of occasions, as have Ukrainian analysts and other policymakers, that they fully recognize that the territories that Russia currently holds, occupies, will not be able to be returned by military means, which is another way of saying that their occupation will be recognized de facto, but not de jure. That's fine. And in principle, a rational Russian leadership should be willing to accept that. A rational American and European leadership should be willing to accept something like this, namely a freezing of the conflict, the establishment of some kind of demilitarized zone. It could be called anything, right? And in principle, what's currently known as the kill zone, which is a kind of a no man's land where one is very vulnerable to attack by drones, could easily be, or at least theoretically easily be converted into a demilitarized zone. Soldiers of some kind from other nations of the world would need to be posted. What the exact number is, it's obviously more than 10,000. It's obviously less than 100. Let's assume it's 40 or 50,000. That makes perfect sense. Ukraine would obviously need to have a sufficiently large and well-armed military in order to repel potential Russian attacks in the future. And if the price for that is to reject, or at least to state that one is rejecting membership in NATO, personally, so be it. I'm not personally impressed by NATO's Article 5. It doesn't guarantee a response. It just says that a response of some kind is necessary. And again, this is a point I believe I've made on this program in the past. There is no obligation on the part of any NATO member to respond immediately with arms. They could simply respond by calling a peace conference. What's even more worrying is that even if they were to decide to respond militarily, it would take them somewhere between 1 and 2 months to be able to mobilize their troops and bring them from Western or Central Europe into the war zones of Eastern Europe. And of course, by then, whatever war that Putin might have initiated, be it in Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, possibly even Poland, could very easily be over. So I'm not impressed by NATO. I'm not terrified of neutrality. It's meaningless in the sense that if Russia wants to violate a country's neutrality, just as Germany violated countries' neutrality in the First and Second World Wars, it'll do so very, very happily. So in a way, it's a concession that is pretty much meaningless. What is ultimately the guarantee of Ukraine's security and existence is, of course, Ukraine. That is to say, its armed forces. Now, whether the requisite number of soldiers is 600,000 or 800,000 or 900,000, I don't know. But whatever the number whatever the ideal number is, that's what it has to be. And Ukraine has to be armed with the kind of weaponry, first and foremost, presumably drones, but at the current rapid rate of change on the battlefront, who knows what the next technological innovation will be. But whatever the case, Ukraine needs to have the capacity to defend itself. Its allies within Europe and North America can easily help with ammunition, with armaments, possibly with training. But ultimately, it all comes down to Ukraine's ability to deter a potentially dangerous Russia sometime in the future. As long as Putin is in power, the danger of, well, the continuation of the war is pretty much assured. As I said before, if and when he leaves, and of course he will at some point, then a possible window of opportunity opens. We know from Soviet imperial, from Soviet as well as from Russian history, that in the event of tsars or leaders being either removed from office or being killed or dying, there's usually an opportunity, not always, but usually an opportunity for a power struggle that results in the consideration of a variety of alternative policies, some of which might be worse than those of the extant dictator, some of which might be better. Now, I'm not suggesting that Putin's demise will usher in a period of democratic blossoming in Russia. I'm not at all sure of that. I wouldn't exclude it altogether. I do think there's a possibility that elements within Russian society could rise up and take the initiative. I'm not sure how much money I would bet on that scenario, but I do think we shouldn't exclude it a priori. The more important point is that in the resulting power struggles, we do have hardliners emerging, softliners emerging. Sometimes the hardliners win, as in the case of Stalin's succession to Lenin. Sometimes, as in Khrushchev's replacement of Stalin, it's the softliners. So it depends. And within those sorts of circumstances, that is to say, imagine for the sake of argument, the following two scenarios. One is a power struggle simply takes place and no immediate victor is in sight. That would certainly serve to distract the Russian elites striving for power from the war, and it might induce them, and again, I emphasize the word might, the conditionality of that word, it might induce them to bring this useless struggle to a more rapid end. And then, of course, there is the possibility that the semi-authoritarian alternative, the so-called softliners, might actually come to seize power, if not permanently, then at least temporarily. And they might conceivably be more inclined to come up with some kind of arrangement ending the war, or at least ameliorating the fighting, reducing it significantly. I'm not sure, again, how likely these scenarios are. They're simply projections. One might say that they're wishes on my part. There is, of course, the alternative that an evildoer worse than Putin would come to power. Personally, I'm less persuaded by that because I'm not quite sure. I have difficulty imagining someone worse than Putin. As bad as, yes. Worse, I'm not so sure. But there again, that's speculation on my part, and of course on everybody's part as well. Let me end on the following point. We have not seen the last of peace plans. The one thing that we know for sure about the Trump administration is that we don't know anything for sure about the Trump administration. He seems to have shifted ground in his attitude towards Russia and Ukraine, 5, 6, perhaps as many times as 10. Every few weeks, there's a new plan. First, it was going to be ending the war in 24 hours. Then it was 3 months, then it was 2 months, now who knows. So the plans will likely continue, even though Mr. Trump says the war isn't his. The longer he stays in office, the longer he tries to come up with some kind of conclusion to the war, the more the war becomes his. A year after Biden's defeat, it's becoming increasingly less persuasive to argue that this isn't my responsibility, this isn't my war, and it would never have occurred had I been in office. All those things may have been true at some point, but they're no longer persuasive. And as I said, the longer this continues, the less persuasive will they become. So for what it's worth, I can imagine that the Americans will continue probing, trying to come up with some kind of deal. I can't imagine that they're going to come up with a coherent deal based on some kind of longer term strategy. There's very little in their behavior thus far to suggest that that would take place, but you never know, miracles do happen. And of course, so everything ultimately rides on the Europeans, Putin and Zelensky. They will have to continue hemming and hawing, proclaiming the greatness of Mr. Trump in order to keep him more or less happy and more or less on their side. But in all likelihood, again, barring some kind of epiphany on the part of the Trump administration or a sudden demise of Putin, either physical or political, I'm inclined to think that the war will continue for the foreseeable future. Now, that sounds like bad news, and of course it is, because people are dying. From the Ukrainian point of view, it is actually not too bad news, inasmuch as their ability to hold a superpower at bay for 4 years is obviously testimony to the strength of the population, the effectiveness of the military, and to the potential of the country to defeat Russia. Again, notice I say potential. That ultimately will depend on the West, and we just don't know how the West will be responding. Fortunately, the Europeans appear to have gotten their act together. Unfortunately, at the same time, the Americans appear to have gotten their act untogether, if there is such a thing. So we might expect some progress on the peace front if and when the Americans and the Europeans and along with the Ukrainians join forces and come up with some kind of strategy. Short of that, this is likely to continue until or unless someone finally says enough and let's get out of here. I don't see the Ukrainians doing that, so it will have to be the Russians, which is possible. Anyway, thank you all for your attention. Perhaps you were expecting a more resolute prognosis. The best I can say is that I can't say much other than suggest what might be alternative scenarios, because given the unpredictability of everybody concerned, it's really just very hard, if not indeed impossible, to suggest what's going to happen a week or month, and certainly a year from today. Anyway, thank you again for your attention. And if you have any questions, comments, critical or positive, I'd be more than happy to entertain them.
Thank you, Dr. Motyl. Please, I am opening the forum for your questions. We should not be too depressed, probably on the wake of Thanksgiving. So hoping for the best for everyone, but still it's very life history in front of us. Please, questions and comments, everyone. To Dr. Motyl, don't be shy, please. While you're thinking, I have, of course, a lot of questions on my own, but how about this for the beginning? Yes, please, John.
So, hi. The report we had from Sergeant Sampson, who visited the front lines not too long ago, was that, if memory serves me right, that the Ukrainians were sustaining fairly well, which is you mentioned miracles. That to me is still a miracle that they've been able to withhold the Russians to, as you mentioned, a slower than snail's pace. I guess in the form of a question, um, there was some uncertainty as to whether the Russian oligarch money was going to be used by the Europeans. I think that happened. Can you clarify that? And the sustainability of that kind of funding is going to run out eventually. So if the Europeans are the banker, I guess the question is, how long is the bank going to be open?
Good question. It's an issue of about, I mean, I've seen varying amounts, but somewhere between 200 and 300 billion dollars of seized assets. And apparently this money is in 2 Belgian banks, and it's just lying there. And thus far, the Europeans have used some of the interest generated by the money in order to help Ukraine, but that's relatively small, a few billion here, a few billion there. The question is, will they appropriate these monies and use them in their entirety? At this point in time, most European countries, if not indeed all of them, other than Belgium, have pretty well, and of course Orban's Hungary, Fico's Slovakia, but the big players, the French, the Germans, and then the smaller players on the European continent, are all in agreement that it would be wise to seize the money. Again, they don't speak of appropriating it. There's all sorts of legalism is being evolved so as to make this, more or less legitimate legally, or actually to make it legitimate legally, not just to make it look legitimate, but to make it actually legitimate. The Belgians have been resisting because they're afraid of what this might do to the trustworthiness of their banks. And they've been claiming that the risks are still too high. My personal guess, all right, so basically the only obstacle to the money being used for Ukraine, and again, imagine that it's about 250 billion. The Europeans need roughly 50, 60 billion a year in order to fund the Ukrainian army at the levels it needs to be funded. So this would amount to 3, possibly 4 years of funding, which is more than Putin is likely to be able to do in order to sustain the war. So that would be terrific. It would work for the Europeans. Again, remember, they do have they are interested in helping Ukraine. It would be good for Ukraine, obviously. The thing that is at this point holding things back is the Belgians. As I said, my guess is that the Europeans will prevail for a simple reason. I mean, they are the majority, the Belgians are a minority. The European Union and the Europeans in general are masters at coming up with complicated legalistic formula that are incomprehensible to everybody. And there's no reason why they couldn't do something similar with these monies. And lastly, Belgium is just one country, one small country, dealing with, with some very heavy hitters. So my guess is, given the alternatives, which is to reach into their own pockets, raise taxes in countries whose populations have been inured to decades of social welfare and things like that, to raise taxes for the cause, for a war of some kind that some Europeans still perceive as being relatively distant. That's complicated, far easier simply to take the money. So I'm betting on the money being taken. I'm betting on the Belgians eventually saying sure, with the following, stipulations. And that would solve everybody's problem, at least for 4 years.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Motyl. Here is a question from our professor, Larry. Please, Larry, I have.
Hi, Dr. Motyl. When Trump first took office, he said that what we really need to do is cut off Russia's source of money, which is oil. And he said what we need to do is drive the price of oil down. And now with secondary sanctions causing China and India to at least cut back dramatically on their imports of oil from Russia, with the slowing global economy also causing maybe the price of oil will go down to $50 a barrel. Some say as far as $30 a barrel. Yeah, that would definitely at $30 a barrel, Russia would not be able to make enough money to pay for its oil wells operating. So it looks to me that things are going to get worse for the Russian economy, maybe very worse. And what do you think might happen with China? You know, I mean, as for an alliance that knows no boundaries, you know, China cutting back on its importation of Russian oil and creating new maps showing, Siberia as part of China, the old maps. Surely Putin has to be worried about fighting wars on two fronts at this point. That's got to be in his mind. Do you think that it might become desperate to make some sort of truce with Ukraine, maybe along the current lines of engagement that might entice him to? What do you think is going to happen as far as the economy?
Well, the economy, I frequently listen to two opposition economists, or three. And, you know, they're both living abroad. They're very well versed in the minutiae of the Russian economy. They follow events extremely closely. And they both concur, as a matter of fact, they have concurred for about a year and a half, possibly even longer, that the Russian economy is headed for disaster. That's even a term that they use. They sometimes talk about calamity, sometimes disaster, sometimes catastrophe. But it's the combination of high inflation. Officially, inflation is somewhere around 9%. Unofficially, at least on consumer goods, it's apparently in the 20s. So you have high inflation, you have very low growth within the consumer sector. For a few years, due to the fact that Putin was pumping money into the military sector, that was doing very well. And of course, that raised the GDP by several percentage points per year. But as of about half a year ago, even the growth of the military sector of the economy, which has been the driver, that slowed significantly as well. So you have inflation. You've got a declining economy that seems to be set to go into a recession mode. You've got the pressure produced by what you mentioned, the price of oil falling. As a matter of fact, I mean, the Chinese and the Indians were paying very good, you know, we're paying far less than they normally would have been paying in the past. So this just, you know, the recent lowering of the price of oil just adds insult to injury. Anyway, you add up all these factors. Oh, the growing deficit, budget deficit, the need to close it in some ways, either by raising taxes, which no one wants to do, or by printing money and risking hyperinflation, which no one also wants to do. Basically, the solution to the solution to the economic problems of Russia is very simple. And on a number of occasions, as these two economists have pointed out, Russian officials have openly hinted at the fact that it's been the requirements of the so-called special military operation that are causing all these troubles for the Russian economy in general. So the solution to the economic problems is relatively straightforward, end the war. But of course, Putin can't, or at least I think he can't. So Russia faces a serious conundrum. They don't seem to be able to win the war. In not winning the war, they're losing their economy. And if you just project this based on theories of revolution, rebellion, breakdowns, systemic breakdowns, things like that, all this begins to resemble a textbook instance of a systemic breakdown. You lose a war, the economy is in the toilet, the population is dissatisfied, the elites are fragmented. What's next? Well, again, based on my readings of some historical case studies, but mostly of theories of systemic breakdowns, all of that seems to pretend that something serious could very well be in the works. And then, as you said, there's the China factor. I would add to that the North Korean factor. On the one hand, they serve to buttress the Russians, but at the same time, the nature of the relationship between Russia and China, arguably even between Russia and North Korea, is not one of equal to equal, it's one of vassal to lord. And as you say, Putin, who is certainly hard-headed enough of an individual to understand the realities of geopolitics, certainly he must appreciate that he's driving Russia into China's arms. But again, it's a process that will also really result in Russia's diminution as a great power. But it's the price he needs to pay, at least temporarily, for Chinese support and for North Korean support. Ultimately, in the longer run, that will be a bitter pill to swallow because, as you said, the Chinese are completely dedicated to pursuing their own interests. They occasionally align those interests with those of Russia, but they are basically a status quo power, whereas the Russians are decidedly revisionist. Putin would like to upturn the apple cart in all of Eurasia. China wants to keep things as is, with the possible exception of Taiwan. And of course, the Chinese have historical grounds for claiming significant portions of Siberia. Putin has to know that this is an issue. And the Chinese, of course, have certainly made it clear to the Russians, perhaps not so much in policy statements by Xi Jinping, but in the more oblique statements made by scholars in various Chinese journals, that the Chinese are interested in those territories they lost in the mid-19th century, as well they should be. That was an outright case of Russian imperialism. And if it's a question of getting territories back that belong to you or belonged to you, then certainly the Chinese have a far better claim to these territories than do the Russians. But for the time being, so far, this alliance seems to be holding. Some people say it's going to crack. Some say it's not going to crack. All I know from history is that sooner or later, all alliances experience difficulties. So one can expect something like that to happen here as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Motyl. I see Anara's hand. We have time for another question, please.
Thank you very much for your good and comprehensive analysis. And I have a couple questions. Some experts predict that Russia may provoke or attack Poland or the Baltic states in the near future. What do you think about this? Or in what kind of form it might be? And the second question, so what elite group may replace Putin's circle? There might be Siloviki, KGB group, or business elite, any group that can negotiate with the West and China.
Your second question first. I mean, it would have to be, the two groups you mentioned have to be involved in some fashion or other. So the business elite, the oligarchs, those individuals within the political elite who have ties to them, they obviously have to take part in whatever upending might take place. That's clearly the case, if only because that's the group that is likely to be most rational, most inclined to end the war, and most able to establish or reestablish connections with the West. But at the same time, no possible putsch, coup, or any kind of similar scenario could happen in the absence of the FSB's support. So the FSB has to be involved in some fashion or other as well. We know from Soviet history that the KGB, with all of its manifold excesses and atrocities, was by the 1980s somewhat of a reformist force. I don't want to exaggerate the degree to which it was reformist, but they were at least concerned with some degree of speeding up of Ukrainian. Not sure how terribly committed they were to perestroika, but certainly Ukrainian was very much in their agenda. So having them on the plotter's side will be fundamental. And of course, if they don't have them on their side, if the FSB is not on the side of the plotters, then the plotters will simply be arrested. So all the more reason for some kind of coalition along those lines to happen. It could, as I just tried to suggest, the business elite is most pro-Western, and the FSB is potentially most concerned with saving the Russian Federation from some kind of collapse. Now, again, we don't know that for a fact, but it would seem to be that those two groups, as you suggest quite rightly, would have to be involved in some kind of disturbing affair. As to your first question, I've been predicting, or I've been suggesting, that Estonia is an ideal target for the Russian military. I've been saying this for about 20 years. So either I'm very right or very wrong. You can decide for yourselves. And that was one of the reasons why I thought that NATO's enlargement to incorporate Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania was ultimately a geostrategic mistake. Not because I don't like these countries, I wish them all the best and I like them very much, but because it always struck me as highly unlikely, if not impossible, that the United States, Germany, or France would send Marines to defend Estonia or Latvia from Russian paratroopers. I still can't see that happening today, even more so than 20 years ago. So in effect, these countries are extremely vulnerable. They know it. They're trying to adopt a variety of measures, building walls, building ditches, mobilizing the population, because they know that they could be the next targets. It would make sense for Putin to try to create some kind of hybrid war situation in a country like Estonia. It would make sense for a number of reasons. One is it would almost immediately expose NATO as a paper tiger. It would create all sorts of divisions within NATO. People would start pointing fingers at one another. You were closer, but you did nothing, but you're stronger and you did nothing. It could be the end of NATO. Of course, the downside for Putin is that he then loses his ability to claim that Ukraine will become a member of NATO and therefore has to be conquered. But I think that would be a small price for him to pay to destroy NATO as an alliance. The other point is that, and again, this is something that I think I first wrote about 25 years ago. Russia doesn't need to invade Estonia, or at least not immediately. All it needs to do is to create some fictitious Estonian people's movement, set off a few bombs in a crowded center, say in Narva, A number of Russians or Russian speakers are killed. A fictitious Estonian fascist movement claims responsibility and then says that this is the beginning of a continued attack on the Russian imperialist presence and the colonizers in Narva and the region. And then the fictitious Estonian People's Front calls on Mr. Putin to save them from fascism. And he could do that by sending troops. He could do that by sending paratroopers. He could do that in any number of ways. That wouldn't necessarily entail declaring or starting a special military operation. It could be significantly less than that. And as I said, my personal belief is that no NATO country would rush to these countries' aid, possibly with the exception of the Poles. They
Maybe
have that.
Finns are ready, some say.
The Finns are ready. So, okay, Finns and Poles, which would make a difference. But it would be complicated. It would be very, very complicated. And the Finns and the Poles would be pointing fingers at the Germans and the Spaniards and the Italians and saying, why aren't you doing anything? And our boys and girls are dying on the front and you're simply sipping beer and wine. And then there's a question of whether the intervention by the Finns and the Poles would succeed. Maybe yes, maybe no. Putin could ultimately decide, having reestablished democracy in Narva, and having killed the fictitious Latvian fascist front, he can now withdraw while insisting that Russian language rights be maintained, something along those lines. And he could just adopt a humanitarian pose and say, I did this simply because of my love for human rights.
I agree with you. That might be like in Donbass. That's worked well for initially. So for them.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. And we have time for the last question, I hope. Leslie, please. Microphone, Leslie. You're muted. You're muted. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry about that.
Yes.
Yes, this might be going back into the weeds and kind of returning to what we were talking about at the beginning, but with the 28-point peace plan, after that was reported on by Axios, Steve Witkoff actually tweeted out or X'd out, quote, they must have gotten this from K. And I've heard some speculation on the BBC that the K he was referring to was probably a Russian negotiator named Kirill Dmitrov, and that this may not have been something he intended to tweet out publicly. It may have been a message he was sending to someone privately that he just goofed up and sent out publicly. But my question is basically a speculative one, which is, who do you think he might have been trying to send that message to?
No, I have no idea. Presumably to one of his people in the administration, but I just don't know. I don't know. Maybe it was Rubio. Who knows? It could have been. This is more than just complete speculation at this point. But given the amateur hour quality of so many of the people in the Trump administration, their lack of credentials, their lack of experience, their lack of knowledge, and Witkoff is probably the prime example of this, but Hegseth comes in as a close second. It's not inconceivable that this was a message to Witkoff's son or daughter or wife. Again, I'm saying that this is purely speculative. I mean, I don't want to bet on this at all, but it's not inconceivable. You remember that scandal, when was this, 3 months ago, where Hegseth this was when we bombed Yemen, the Houthis in Yemen, and he arranged for a meeting and inadvertently invited the editor of The Atlantic. Now, who does
Jeffrey
that?
Goldberg.
Jeffrey Goldberg, exactly. Now, who does that? That requires a degree of incompetence that is simply, jaw-breaking. But they did it. What can one say? But then, again, as I'm sure there are basically two views of the Trump administration. One is, and it's the one that I've just been presenting, that basically they're incompetent and don't really know what they're doing, there's lots of evidence to support that. But there's another view, which is not totally crazy, which is that all of this is part of some kind of larger master plan to confuse everybody. And they know what they're doing, which is to confuse all of us. They're certainly succeeding in confusing all of us. But in reality, they know exactly what they're doing. I'm personally not persuaded by that. But, you got to admit it's at least a plausible alternative explanation.
Well, I would say that I kind of have a view that's sort of a combination of those two ideas, which is one, I think that they really are that incompetent, but at the same time that the entire Trump administration on some level might be most, at this point, at least partially a charade to distract us from what the big tech people are doing, like Larry Ellison and Peter Thiel, and maybe what they're doing is the real ball game with trying to get AI into everything and trying to run the government with data centers and stuff like that. And everything else is just a distraction and a smokescreen over that.
Which is conceivable, A good friend of mine who's a very intelligent analyst makes a case that is very similar to that. At first glance, it smacks of conspiracy theory. But on second glance, why not? It just goes to show we don't really know. It's not that we just don't know what Putin is thinking. We have a pretty good sense of what Zelensky is thinking, but we don't know what Putin is. But we certainly don't know what the Trump administration is thinking. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Dr. Motyl. This was a fascinating, and we thank you for your time and expertise. And we do live in interesting times. We wish full victory to our Ukrainian friends. Of course, program been here for every week, March 22, and we hope to see you again when things change somewhere. We hope we can at least record what is going on and connect people and bear witness to what is going on. I want to say a few words to my friends in Ukraine. Дорогі брати і сестри в Україні, ми вас у наших щоденних думках і молитвах. Нехай милосердний Бог бере вас у своїй опіці наступного тижня в Україні. Героям слава.
Slava Ukraine.
Heroim Slava.
Heroim Slava.
Thank you all.
So much. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.